So I grew up just outside of Chicago, and I moved to the Boston area, moved here to New England in the year 2000 to attend music college and to get a degree in hand drumming, of all things. Does anyone else here have a hand drumming degree? It's just me. All right. That always happens. I was following this dream that I had at the time of being a professional musician and a touring musician. My dream was to play with some famous band, touring the world, traveling to a different city every night of the week, playing to crowds of thousands. And I particularly remember the feeling of my last semester at school as I was looking ahead to after graduation and trying to picture all the different possibilities for this musician's life ahead of me. It was in that last semester that one morning I happened into a classroom where two of my teachers were chatting together. And one of them was talking about his schedule. He had just come back from a 2-week concert tour of Morocco, playing with some incredible Middle Eastern band. And he was just that afternoon leaving for a 4-week tour of Europe. He was going to play with a group called Simon and Garfunkel. Oh, you've heard of them? Yeah, me too. I remember just being in awe, and as he talked with this other teacher, he pointed to the suitcase. His suitcase was sitting there open in the corner of the room. And I remember maybe for the only time of my life feeling jealous of that luggage, that it got to go on this trip with him. That suitcase was the ultimate symbol of success. And I couldn't even picture a more perfect life than this. So I kind of interrupted their conversation a little bit, and I said, "Are you so freaking excited that you can't even stand it?" And I said it just like that, with zero chill. And my teacher kind of looked at the floor, and he looked back at me, and he shook his head a bit, and he said, "You know, man, mostly I just want to go home and see my kid." Now I'm going to be honest with you. I didn't say it, but in that moment what I thought was, surely your kid is not as cool as Simon and Garfunkel. But I knew enough to keep my mouth shut, and I was embarrassed by how tone-deaf I'd been to the conversation they were really having. He wasn't talking about how he was living the dream. He was talking about how hard it was to balance the value of music in his life, something he understood as well as anyone I have ever met, with the value of his family and his home life and community and connections. I remember looking back at that suitcase, and all of a sudden it carried a completely different weight. My unfolding sense of true success, as Adrienne Marie Brown would define it, my understanding of a life well lived is that, first of all, it is a journey and not a destination that can be finally arrived at. And that it's, second, an increasing embrace of one's values, even in the face of increasing complexity. This reminds me of a poem by Naomi Shihab Nye called Famous. She says, "The boot is famous to the earth, more famous than the dress shoe, which is only famous to floors." I want to be famous, she says, in the way that a pulley is famous or a buttonhole, not because it ever did anything spectacular, but because it never forgot what it could do. Remembering what we can do is the work of we, the future ancestors. Adrienne Marie Brown goes on to ask us, how will we, the future ancestors, align ourselves with the most resilient practices of our species? I think that's a good question to ask ourselves as we ponder success. Rabbi Tarfon asked a similar question in the 1st century AD, 2 millennia ago, when he said, "It's not your responsibility to finish the work of perfecting this world, but you are not free to desist from it either." My hope for my days, and for yours, dear ones, is to attend to the complexity of our time with our best selves, to face the crises of our day even when it's complicated, and to do what is our work to do even when we are feeling overwhelmed by the list of all that must be done. Now, when I think of redefining success, I sometimes think of one of our movement ancestors, William Ellery Channing. Channing is remembered as one of the great founders of Unitarianism, a preacher in Boston in the 1800s. He was hailed as a model of religious leadership, and he was a powerful voice for justice, and particularly for abolition in his time. But we know that success is just as much about the journey as the destination, and that was true even for Channing. Because while Channing always supported the ideas and the goals of the abolitionists, he didn't always love how they went about it. He had some complaints about some of the personalities in leadership, and he particularly didn't like their messaging. He thought they were just too emotional and too passionate about the cause. It seemed unreasonable and not rooted in intellect and discourse. To be frank, it reminded him too much of the itinerant revivalists that were sweeping the country at the time with their overly emotional worship services. Now, the only constant in my life since college is my job as an itinerant revivalist, but that's okay. I don't take his comments personally. So one night, Channing's at this anti-slavery forum, and all evening long he has been criticizing the movement. Till eventually, a more active leader, Samuel May, can't take it any longer, and he loses it. He interrupts eventually, saying, "Dr. Channing, I am tired of these complaints. It's not our fault that those who might have conducted this great reform so much more prudently than we can have left us to manage as we may. It's not our fault that those who might have pleaded for the enslaved so much more wisely and so much more eloquently than we can have been silent. We are not to blame, sir, that you have not spoken. And now that inferior men have begun to act and begun to speak against what you acknowledge to be an awful system, well, it is not becoming of you to complain of us that we do it in an inferior style." Now, this is what the kids would call a sick burn. And this burn was so sick that Channing was unable to answer Samuel until eventually he said, "Brother May, I have been silent too long." I love that this story depicts the very moment that Channing took up the work that was his to do. Not to finish it, but neither to desist from it. It depicts the very moment that he took up the work of attending to the crises of his time, even when it felt complicated. I love this story because I've so often been in the place of Samuel May, where I've ended up arguing with so-called allies who say they share my values, but they would rather criticize the minutia of the work from afar than get scuffed up in the fray of making real change themselves. And I love this story because I have just as often been in Channing's place. Just as often, I've blamed other people's words for my own silence. I've blamed other people's actions for my own inaction. Too many times I've clung to some sense of moral purity instead of taking real steps to alleviate the suffering of my own human family. Now, it can feel easy to look back at history's great debates of slavery versus abolition, and we know who was right and who was wrong. But we should remember it did feel complicated to those folks at the time. And we should remember that the 13th Amendment that eventually did outlaw slavery in this country left an exception for those found guilty of a crime. And then suspiciously, our country began finding more people guilty of crimes than just about any other in the world. So that in 2022, the ACLU reported that forced labor in U.S. prisons generated $11 billion in goods, paying out an average of 13 to 50 cents an hour. Unitarian Universalist congregations have covenanted together to abolish this prison system and this system of forced slavery as we know it. But the work is complicated. The movement is still figuring out what it'll look like to replace a system of punishment with one of healing, what it'll look like to replace a system of doing more harm with one of true healing and reparations. Perhaps Channing had missed that day in school, the day when the teacher explained that even if we have hundreds of questions about how to go about our days, our work together still adds up to something. We know that our children will someday tell similar stories of us, stories of a time when the world was changing fast, when we put our neighbors in cages by the millions, when climate chaos arrived with devastation in our cities and neighborhoods, when our country was flooding and on fire at the same time. And they will surely speak of how premeditated wealth inequality made every one of these crises more difficult to address. But I hope they will have other stories to tell as well. Stories of Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too movement and the Sunrise movement, of those who came together even when the work was complicated, even when the path forward was unclear. I hope they will tell the stories of communities and congregations like this one that took up the work that was ours to do, even when there was so much to be done. Writer and atheist prophet Ta-Nehisi Coates spoke of this in a letter to his son when he said, "History is not solely in our hands, but still you are called to struggle, not because it assures you victory, but because it's what assures you an honorable and a sane life." Now, there was a time that I thought success was traveling the world with some famous band. And, well, the truth is, if Paul Simon called me up this afternoon, I'd be on the next plane out of here. But now I understand that success is also as those who are able to stay at the table in community and continue to work together in covenant even when it's hard. I think success now is the people who choose restorative justice and other alternatives to the prison system when harm has been done. I think success can be finding a way just to support your family when housing costs are too high and the minimum wage is too low. And certainly it's finding some way to make the world better, even when we have more questions about it than answers. Love, which is the beginning and the end of the story of Unitarian Universalism, means acting for compassion and for justice, even when the people are complicated and even when the path is unclear. Because the people are always complicated, and the path is always unclear. Honorable struggle that Coates spoke of means taking up the work that is ours to do, not to finish it, but never to desist from it. And so, dear ones, may we live deeply into the journey we will not regret. May we aspire to the fame of the boot and the buttonhole, never forgetting what we can do. And may we love each other deeply, building up the messy and beautiful and holy communities that make a difference and make this life worth celebrating. May it be so, and may we make it so. Amen.